All right. Good morning, class. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So here we are. Here I am. There you are. Oh my gosh. Okay, so the way we're going to do this from now on is that I'm going to be streaming a little bit of myself in here as well. Okay, checking we got everything working so that you can, not because I want you to see me, I know you all miss my face very much, but I was thinking last lecture, lecture 10, we're really getting into a lot of detailed characteristics of movement. And so in order to really be able to convey that to you, I need to be able to show you versus tell you. So just verbally describing movement is probably not going to cut it for as far as what we want to accomplish in the class. So I have some different props here today because we're going to be talking about fine motor development, basically doing things with our hands, and it just wouldn't translate very well in my mind if what we tried to do, if what I tried to do was just to try and describe to you all of these different grasping and reaching type things. It just wouldn't really mean as much. So we're going to do it this way, and I'm even going to try and include a second webcam so that we can do even more elaborate type of demonstrations, so that it just kind of helps add to this whole experience that we're going through now instead of just basically listening to me talk. Okay, so without further ado, today we're talking about fine motor development, chapter 11. All right, this is the only chapter we're talking about today. And so fine movements / fine motor skills are integral to motor development in general. So in order for you to do an ADL, so an activity of daily living, play a sport, a game, think about moving your Monopoly piece from one square to another, to exercise, performing different fitness tasks, you need basically to have some kind of ability to manipulate objects in the outside world to a very fine degree, right? You might have seen videos of people who have double amputees of both arms being able to paint with their feet. Probably took them a lot of time to practice to be able to do that. It is possible to develop fine motor skills through the manipulation of your feet and toes to move objects, but we're going to be focusing on our hands because that's generally what everyone does. Okay, so it's integral for everything. So it's also very important to be able to use your hands in a very fine motor way, especially in academics or social development, because you think about the number one way that we learn how to communicate with one another outside of speech is through writing, and our ability to write letters, to be able to draw. These are all things that are critically important for our ability to participate in academics and to socialize and to be able to express ourselves, right? So if we don't have fine motor control to be able to use the mighty pen, then we're definitely going to be able to, we're lacking in our ability to express ourselves and to be able to engage socially and cognitively, okay? And of course, also something we'll talk about today is that we develop these skills. They're very useful for us throughout most of our life, and then of course, as many other things we've talked about in class, at a certain age point in our life, they begin to decline. So here you see several, and I can move myself around because I'm blocking these different types of prostheses here, prostheses, and these are all different. The advancement in prosthetics has really come a long way since the beginning of the war in Afghanistan, which is now ended, but because so many soldiers were returning home with amputations of the lower limb or the upper limb, there's been a dramatic increase in ways that these things can be designed to allow for more fine motor skill application, because it is so critical in everyday life, okay? So prehension, this is primarily what we talk about when the use of being able to use the hand, and it applies specifically to grasping, right? So the ability to open the hand, identify an object, close the hand, and bring it to whatever we're doing with it then. Okay, so it's something that takes a very long time for an infant to do, and it's something that we use every day after we learn it, right? Okay. And so this is your brain, right? This is one part of your brain. Okay, so this perhaps looks a little familiar. This is the whole brain here that we kind of talked about a little bit in a previous class. This is the front of the brain, the anterior portion, the top of the brain, the superior portion, the back of the brain, the posterior portion, and the bottom of the brain, the inferior portion. And this red slice here that's highlighted is called your primary motor cortex. And the reason that I'm showing you this is that if we kind of were to map out the brain, what we would find is that if I were to apply an electrical stimulation to every single area of this motor cortex here, what you would find is you would actually get a muscle twitch in different parts of your body depending on where I applied that electrical stimulation. Okay? And so if you can see that there's the area of the brain, so the brain real estate dedicated to a certain brain, to a certain part of the body, is larger for certain parts of the body compared to others. And that's what this description, this photo is showing here, is that people have done these experiments where they've applied electrical stimulation to different parts of the brain, and they basically mapped out, okay, where is the hand and how large is that area in the brain represented? Where's the elbow? Where is that represented? Where's your butt? Where's your feet? Where's your tongue? Where's your voice box? Where's your face? And what they found, interestingly enough, is that your hand, as you can see in this image here, takes up a huge amount of real estate. And it's probably because so much of our brain needs to be dedicated to all of the fine motor capability of the hand because of all the skill required to manipulate so many different objects in space. And so it makes sense that your hand takes up a bigger portion of your brain, even though it's the relatively small portion of your whole body compared to, you say, the entire upper arm. So if we look here, what you can see is that the upper arm takes up a relatively small area of the brain compared to the hand. That's because, well, the arm, the elbow, it only really requires to do this, right? You can see that. Yeah, look at that. Compared to your hand has to be able to, you twist your hand, you can touch your fingers with all of your, be able to spread your hands out, to be able to grasp things, be able to grip things with one type of grip versus another type of grip, using kind of a claw motion versus a pincer motion versus a grasping motion. So if your brain didn't dedicate this much space, we probably wouldn't be able to do as many things with our hand, okay? So this kind of gives you a context for why the hand is so important. Well, your brain certainly thinks your hand is important, so that's why we focus on it so much in research. And so Halverson's stages of grasping development back in 1930, so almost 100 years ago. There was a classic study done in the area of early manipulation. So early manipulation, meaning how do kids pick up stuff or grab stuff, grasp stuff. And the purpose was to examine the development of prehension, the ability to grasp, in children 16 to 52 weeks old. And so there's really 4 steps to grabbing anything, okay? Got my special object here. I see the object in space, okay? I approach the object so that I am a distance close enough to it that if I actually reached out, I'd be able to grab it. I then reach for the object. I open my hand, just about the size of, just a little bit bigger than what the object is, and then I grab the object in whichever way I seem to be able to, capable of, depending on my age perhaps. I hold the object, and then I let go of the object. Okay? So the 4 stages: see the object, I get close to the object. I grab the object, I let go of the object. Okay? There's a lot of other things in between to really make that happen. Obviously, you can be presented with a lot of different objects, so that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration as well, right? So not just being able to do this, but able to do it flexibly across a lot of different demands and constraints, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Oops, don't want that. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're good. So there are different methods. Oh, let me Come back down here, Andrew. What are you doing? God. Okay, so Halverson described 3 basic methods of reaching, okay? Of approaching / reaching. The most immature method was basically just sweeping the arm. Okay, I have these things in front of me. I'm just going to basically grab and kind of like corral these things into my body. Then it's become more mature. You actually start to approach objects at different angles. Perhaps you kind of come it this way, or you try to climb it in this way. You're kind of using your hand more as kind of a rake, or be able to kind of do a big palm or grasp of something, right? You're really only, again at this age, you're really using one hand. You haven't realized that one hand and the other hand you can use to be able to transport one thing to the other, and gosh, you could even use both hands to be able to pick it up if you wanted to. So you begin to explore the space and be able to exploit the space a little bit more as you get more mature. And then the most mature was to a direct reach is common, and it's very motorically advanced. And so as you begin to just start to reach, you don't reach in a straight line like we kind of talked about in the previous lecture when we talked about manipulation movements in infants. In infants, if I have an object, okay, I'm going to reach to it. All right, so pretend you're kind of looking down at me. If I was reaching to the object like this, I might kind of have a lot of kind of variability in how I'm reaching for this object, compared to a more motorically advanced child would just be able to reach in one straight line, grab it, and be done, right? Not a lot of wasted motion. Early on in reaching, there is a lot of wasted motion because they haven't really been able to learn how to coordinate the shoulder, the elbow, and the hand as one kind of functional unit to move in one direction, right? 3 degrees of freedom, at least, creates a lot of complexity. In order to be able to move, you have to be able to control each degree of freedom synergistically in order to have a very optimal or at least efficient method of reaching. Okay, and so you start out basically as just like this big gobble monster, just kind of flailing your arms around and kind of luckily being able to scoop something in, versus being able to now just reach out with 2 little fingers and be able to grab something as very small like a Lego and be able to bring it to yourself. So be able to go from one stage to the other stage, or these methods as Halverson talks about, takes years, right? There's not a lot of infants going to have have tea with the queen, or queen with the tea, whichever way you prefer. Okay, so there's a lot of the sequence of grasping. It gets pretty exhaustive. Okay, you can look at what pages in your textbook they talk about all these things, but we basically would a few of these things I want to kind of touch on as far as how the sequence of grasping develops with age is the very first one, the primitive squeeze. So as we talked about here, this one is that it's not an actual grasp, because primitive comes back to this word of reflex, primitive reflex, and it's really talking about this palmar grasp reflex. So the infant is holding on to this finger here of this adult, but it's not a real grasp, and that it is being controlled by something other than the cortex. It's being controlled by part of the nervous system that is involuntary. So a grasp has to be actually delivered through volitional movement. Okay, so that's important. I keep looking at myself down here. I need to be kind of looking up here. Hopefully I'll get better with that over time. If that annoys you that I either look down here or look up here, leave a comment and I probably won't read it. Okay, moving forward. So then you kind of get a squeeze grasp, so it's an actual grasp, so it comes from some kind of volitional control. A hand grasp, so I have my object again. I'm using my whole hand to grab it, okay? So I might not even be using any of my fingers or actually touching the object. I'm just kind of using my fingertips are not touching it, but I'm just kind of using my palm to touch it. A palm grasp is kind of the same thing, but now perhaps instead of grabbing something like this, I'm now using my thumb to kind of help control it as well. So now my thumb is in opposition to kind of the whole thing. So I can even be kind of using it like this. It's a little more advanced actually. Superior palm grasp, so if I have my object here, I can grab it with my palm like this. Inferior forefinger grasp, so being able to pick something up like this. This is pretty advanced, so it's more kind of this claw motion. Forefinger grasp, superior forefinger grasp, proximal distal progression. So essentially what this is talking about is this proximal distal progression, going from grabbing things that are very proximal in the hand. So if you take the hand and it's like grabbing things this way, versus distally now I'm grabbing something like this, far from the hand and now focused more on the fingers. That's something that only really has to develop in this kind of sequence. So going from grasping that is very kind of gross not meaning disgusting, gross meaning that it's a large movement, to something very fine, where it's distal from the hand itself or further even from the midline to the body, right? Then that's something that develops in a sequence. You don't really go from this to this overnight. You go from this to this to this to this to this to this to this, okay? And so it's a sequence that has to develop, and that takes practice to do so. And so there's an alternate view to doing all these things, right? Of course, 1989, so jump up about 60 years, thankfully. The type of thing you grasp also predicates how you're going to grasp it, okay? And this kind of makes sense. So I've been showing this object a lot. Grasping this object is requires me to really hold it in one way. There's perhaps one way that I would do this. I have multiple ways of doing it, but the most efficient way is probably to grab it like this. Okay. Now let's say I have a different type of object like this, a little smaller, a little about the same size as the other one. Now how would I pick this up? I could still do it this way. I could grab it like this as well. Okay, so there's a constraint here. There's this hole here. I don't even have to use my finger. I can just kind of do this. But then once I get to a very large object now, okay, I can't do a palmar grasp with it. It's larger than my hand. So I have to be able to change the way that I grasp this now in order to lift it up. Okay, so part of the other things that happen, as you can see here, that with the image of all these hands, and let me move myself back up here again so you can read that text, is that grasping something very small requires maybe something like a pinch like this, compared to if I want to grasp it something that's very large. I have to be able to now adjust how I'm going to do that. Okay, so the constraints of the task, the constraints being the actual object itself, how does it force me to change the way that I'm grasping it, is something that is always has to be considered, especially at an infant and child level, in order to do it successfully. So let's take a very weird object. Okay, look at this thing. Okay, very kind of ununiform in nature. Everything we looked at before was round or like a donut. So if I were to present this to you like this, okay, how would you grab it? Okay, there's perhaps multiple ways. If you had a hand big enough, you could just grab it like this, or you might try to grab it like this, or on the side, or something like that. Okay, now if I flip it around and I present it to you like this, you now have to change the way that you grab it. Do you grab it like this? Do you grab it like this? Do you grab it like this? Okay, and so because the object itself has different properties to it, the way that it's presented to you is going to change the way that you grasp it. And the way that you grasp it is fundamentally determined by some way that you've determined or you've identified how to grasp things most efficiently. Okay, and so it's really going from small objects. You use it with your thumb and finger. Not surprisingly, you wouldn't grab an object like this, okay, compared to an object like this. You grab like this, perhaps, especially if it didn't have this hole in the center. And so the way that you manipulate objects is going to be more dependent on the objects themselves, not necessarily your capability to pick up the object. Okay, It's kind of circular in a way. And so adjustment to task constraints, this is really what all of this continues to talk about here. See if I don't get myself out of the frame. So much text in here. Okay, I might move myself around a little bit. So how forces applied depend on the task, right? So what if I told you, okay, we have this one funky object again, okay, and I want you to pick it up from the end just using 2 fingers. Okay, I would grab it like this, right? I would kind of position my thumb and forefinger in a way so that I can keep it level, especially if the goal is to keep it level. Okay, now if you fix it to the other way, keep the object level and grab it. Okay, how would I do this? I go like this. Okay, I have to kind of change the way that I'm grabbing it now. Would I do it like this? Or would I do it like this? Okay, the goal is also going to determine how you grab something. Okay, if it was just to kind of pick it up and grab it perhaps like this, and I don't care what orientation it's in. Okay, so the ability to be able to differentiate that things are of a different size, that the way that you apply force now is also going to have to be modulated depending on the weight of the thing, the smoothness of the thing, the overall structure of the thing. So if it's a weird object versus a more kind of, an object such as a baseball, then that's going to change the way that you're going to be able to have to pick up those have to apply force, and the way that you then grasp the object, okay? Kind of in sequence, or kind of in relationship to one another. All right. So the developmental sequence of early grasping depends on the exact nature of the task at hand and the object properties. So the task at hand is, what is the goal, right? So I want to pick this up in a certain way. And then the properties of the object are also important. And so not just the weight, not just the size, but if you also think about smoothness, if you're picking up a piece of like wet glass, you have to perhaps pick it up very delicately but firmly in order to be able to do that, to not break it, versus if it's a piece of sandpaper, right? And so the way that the objects look the same, they're both thin, they're long, but the quality and the texture of the object is different, and you have to modulate the way that you pick something up like that. Okay. All right. There's actually some interesting experiments where I have a weird object. I don't have any weird objects in here other than this baby toy. And it has a smooth side and a rough side. And it's like T-shaped actually, so it kind of looks like this, but it's a square. So instead of this weird knobbly thing, it looks like another square, and there's different weights on either side of the object. So let's say this side is much heavier than this side, and one side is smooth and one side is rough, and you're told to pick it up and keep it level by just using your finger and thumb. The way that you do that depended on where the weight is distributed, or if there's no weight at all, and the smoothness and the slickness of the amount of friction on either side is something that you have to kind of figure out and adapt to very quickly. And you can do that very quickly as an adult, but as an infant you have to learn all those properties. How is the weight distributed? What does the object look like? What is the smoothness of the object? Is there a texture that is more rough or more slick? And then you are able to do that very automatically, but as an infant, that is everything that has to be learned in order to be able to grasp something efficiently. Okay, let's come back down. So another thing, kind of cut that off there, that's okay. So not only being able to grab an object, but also to be able to anticipate, right? Anticipation is key. So prior to 9 months of age, a child's application of force in the reach and grasp is unrelated to the weight of the object, meaning that I don't really understand the weight properties of an object yet by looking at it. And so say that if I were to pick up a full gallon of milk versus an empty gallon of milk, the object looks the same, but I know that the weight of it is different because of the context within it. And so my ability to anticipate how heavy it is something that I have learned. And so if you've ever had the experience of where you thought something was heavier than it was, okay, and you grab it and you kind of jerk it very quickly, and it kind of surprises you how light it is, that's because you had some plan, some anticipation of how heavy the object was going to be. And then when you apply that force, it's greater than what you anticipated, so you get a huge kind of jerking motion of the object. Infants don't really possess that ability. Okay, they don't have that capability to be able to plan how much force to apply depending on whatever the predicted weight of the object is. So they do things that are very herky-jerky all the time because they lack that capability. But by about 1 year old, you're able to, you gain that capability, okay? You're able to kind of see how the error in your movement should help and update and eliminate a lot of these kind of herky-jerky movements. So that's what this third bullet's about. By about 1 year old, force application errors may be eliminated for familiar objects. So if you see through repetition, you see the object more and more and more and more, you're going to be able to anticipate exactly how much force you need to apply in order to pick it up to achieve whatever the task goal is, right? If the goal is to throw it, then that's one thing. But if the goal is to lift it to your mouth and eat, that's another, right? You want to be able to modulate that force very precisely. And so by the time they're 18 months old, children exhibit anticipation and can differentiate reaching and grasping responses. And so I can now show an object to an 1.5-year-old, and it can be heavy or it can be light, and they can anticipate how much force to apply because of that property. Okay, so anticipation is super key. It's not just about visual anticipation, it's also about anticipating how you're going to apply force to an object in order to achieve whatever goal. Okay. So haptic perception. Okay, so haptics has to do with the overall sensation that you have of an object. So in your hand, embedded in your hand, are many different sensors that perceive things such as temperature, the kind of coarseness of something, the hardness of something, the kind of edges of a thing, and the kind of overall global shape of something, right? So here I'm covering this up again. Let's come down so you can see all those things. And so here I have my canister of air here. So if I were to go through each of these different things of haptic perception, right? So I wanted to feel the texture of it. You know, I move my fingers across and I can say it's smooth. If I were to press into it and say it's firm. If I were to basically just put my hand on top of it, I say it's about room temperature. If I were to then put my fingers across the edges of it, I can get a sense for how round it is versus how kind of edgy it is. And then if I were to kind of hold my whole hand around it, I can say, okay, I get the general sense of what the shape is. And so I can do that, obviously, without using my vision. So if you were to give me a random object with my eyes closed and I were to grab it, I'd say, okay, I can tell that this fits in my hand. It feels round. It is firm. It has different types of texture on it. So I can feel there's laces here, and then there feels like something that's leather here. And oh, it's a baseball. And I would be able to guess that without having to see it. And it's because I have all this haptic perception that allows me to do that. And the way that I perceive each property is through these different types of finger motions. So I wouldn't really be able to perceive the overall firmness of it by doing this, right? And I wouldn't be able to perceive how smooth something is by pushing into it, right? And I wouldn't be able to perceive the overall global shape of it by pushing into it as well, or by just kind of putting my finger around it. I might be able to perceive the temperature of it, but you kind of do that when you you have the stove on, or you don't know if you have the stove on. If you have like one of those electric stoves, you put your hand over it. You know, that's a way that you kind of are trying to, you don't put your hand on it, you put it over it, but you don't really perceive your stove temperature by doing this. Right. You perceive it by kind of putting your hand over and going like, that's hot. Okay. So Haptic ability is something that takes a long time to also be fully developed, really by late childhood, middle to late childhood, early adolescence. And it's something that, this is why you give kids a whole bunch of like weird things like this, right? So this one has a lot of texture to it. It's also round, it has a weird shape. This one is smoother and it's round and it has a weird shape. This thing, it has all sorts of like weird properties to it. Okay, and so all of these things together give you that experience, that haptic experience, to be able to refine perception. Okay, and that's why it's important to give kids a variety of toys, so that of different textures and weights and firmness and contouring, so that they can develop that perception as well. And that feeds back into how you grasp things. So now if you have a perception of what a thing is and the properties within it, then that's going to allow you to better grasp something in the long term. So there's phases in object manipulation. Okay, there's phase 1, there's phase 2, there's phase 3. And these phases go sequentially from birth to about 10 months old. And I don't know if there's even more phases than that, I forgot. Nope, just 3 phases. Hallelujah. And so phase 1, from birth to 3 months, simply clutch objects in one's hand, fist, mainly due to palmar grasp reflex. So remember, that palmar grasp reflex sticks around till about 4 months and then it goes away. And perhaps doesn't go away, it's just that object manipulation, volitional movement from the cortex comes down and overrides it. Then, after that reflex kind of fades away, or at least volitional control overcomes the reflex, 4 to 9 months old, that's when more hand movements occur. So they start to really poke and scratch and rub and wave and bang objects together, and now they're getting all of these haptic sensitivities, and they're beginning to kind of realize the relationship between how their arm moves in space and what they perceive in space, and then the relationship between themselves and that. So all of these things are happening as far as what we talked about: senses, binocular vision, my perception, my be able to track an object, my ability to be able to now reach for that object that I perceive to be within some distance of myself. Oftentimes in this early stage they don't have a good perception of that, and so they might see something across the room and want to reach for it and thinking that it's within close reach, but in fact it's like 10 feet away. And so these are all things that have to kind of be coordinated, and they develop with one another. My visual perception of something, my haptic perception of something, and then my actual motor capability to do these things, all of them probably feed off of one another in order to progress through these phases. So when you get to phase 3, 9 to 10 months old, sitting unsupported, like we talked about, is huge. So now your hands are free. It makes it easier for you to now be able to locomote from one area, sit up, have hands free, and now you can start to grab things and really experiment with all this types of stuff, much to the delight or detriment of the parents. And this then will allow for having hands free to then realize, oh, okay, I have this thing. Oh, I can do this. Oh, I can continue to like take all these things, put them in my other hand, and now I have them all with me, and now I can kind of go through space, right? And now I can manipulate and grasp and hold things, and then I can get rid of all of them if I want to as well. Okay, and so now I kind of have this whole repertoire of ability to be able to pick things up, configure them, and move them depending on their shape, size, weight, texture, all of these things, because I've basically been spending the last 6 months learning all of that. And they do that through a lot of repetition. Okay. And so fine movements in touch and perception in adults. So now, after 10 months old, you have a lot of the baseline, the foundation that you need to be able to reach and grasp things. And over time, you maintain that, or you even improve it further and further, depending on what kind of things you do in your life. Start to play sports, or if you start to do other sorts of things like dance or construction or whatever, those things are something that improve up until about 45 years old. Then about 45 years old, for whatever reason, most likely either because the sensors in the hand begin to degenerate, or the nerves in the brain begin to degenerate, or something in between, then you start to lose this fine motor control and this haptic perception. And it's not really well known which goes first, right? And it's not necessarily a cognitive thing either, okay? So after 45 years, we just start to see things decline. But there's no age-related differences in performance on haptic tests that were more dependent on a cognitive element to determine object property, right? So you have all of these things stored in memory. So there's even if your performance on a haptic task is diminished, it does not mean it's dependent on a cognitive element. Okay, it has to primarily do with your overall ability to sense it. And I can help redefine that later. But and then work experiences, unfortunately, it's really just has to do with the sensors itself is what declines. Even if you have prior experience, so your touch, your ability to really be able to, if someone says you have great touch, that's something that just declines as you get older. But the rate of decline is different, and where you start from is different for everyone. So it's not like it's just a steep fall, and then that's it. No. And so, handwriting and drawing. So this is very important for kids to learn. Hand-eye coordination, most importantly. It's a very complicated motor skill, so it not only takes hand-eye coordination, but also be able to take your thoughts and put them on paper in some way, or some perception you have of the world and put it on paper. Okay? And so what's interesting is that we are becoming a computer-based society, but learning how to write, especially early on in childhood, is very important. And children who lag in handwriting development may lag behind in other areas, such as lower math achievement scores, lower IQ scores, and verbal areas, more difficulty attending to key points in class, and may struggle with the pace of work. So you really think about the ability to draw, and it really comes in to write, and it has a lot of elements into it that are necessary to be able to really excel at all these points I just made. When you're writing or drawing, you're focusing on that one thing, and you're not just focusing on like doing something kind of mundane, you're focusing on creating something, and your capability of creating that is very much entwined with your capability to look at something, draw something, and then be able to perform that thing. So you have an idea in your head, you see the paper, and then you have to, in a coordinated fashion, then be able to do that. This actually takes longer to do. It takes a decade to really be able to do this in early life compared to just reaching and grasping. So this is a skill that takes a lot of fine-tuning over time. It takes a lot of cognitive capability to do, right? We take it for granted because we're old. But for children, it's very important. And so it all starts with scribbles for the most part, and then it evolves into being able to actually create geometric shapes, and then it evolves into being able to write letters, and then it evolves into being able to create characters or representations of things in the world. The quality of writing about 5 to 6 years old, this is when drawing and writing also really increase. And handwriting is very cognitively based before 3rd grade, and then in about 3rd grade, that's when it becomes more automatic. The legibility and speed are considered the most important components of handwriting, right? So you want to be fast and accurate, speed and accuracy. And so this is things that you can kind of use as a gauge for how well a child writes. Go ahead and write your name, Timothy. How long did it take Timothy to write his name? And when he finishes his name, does it actually look like it says Timothy? If not, it took him a long time and it's not legible, we need to work on that. And it's important to work on that. You can't just text me your name anymore. Write it. Okay. And so there's a lot of factors that you can use if you wanted to intervene now with our kind of hypothetical Timothy character. Alright, I want you to improve at being able to write your name, Timothy. First, your sitting position. Don't sit so awkwardly when you do this. Try to sit upright, feet on the floor, hand on the desk, arm on the desk, and be facing the piece of paper. Don't be like doing something like this. Okay? The chair and the desk configuration is also important, so don't be askew like this. Be facing forward like this. Type of writing implement. This is a very fine-tipped pen versus if we were to use a large kind of Sharpie marker. Environmental factors. Is the TV on? Are there kids all around running? They need to be able to focus. So environmental factors are there any distractions out there? Okay. Type of instruction. The way that you instruct people is very important, especially for kids. Though kind of this was a lot of what my master's thesis was about. You can look all that up, but the way you instruct people is very important. And then the amount of practice. You're going to write your name once today, Timothy? Or how about we try and write it 1,000 times? Or until your arm falls off. How's that sound? And then that will also probably contribute. So all of these things, you might think just like, okay, Timothy, sit down and practice. Is all you have to do in order to get him to improve. But everything else on this list is also very important. You have to take care of the basics in order to really be able to improve all of these things that are critical for handwriting performance. And of course, as you see, when a kid begins to write stuff, whatever it is, or start to scribble, they don't do it very legibly with, the very stereotypical tripod style of writing, right? They grab it like this, and then they go all over the place, and then they grab it like this, and then they go all over the place. So there's this supinate grasp, there's the pronate grasp, and then there's finally they get to this kind of much more sophisticated looking grasp, this kind of tripod type of grasp where it gives you a lot more control, right? So because I have my pen in this tripod, and I hold it a little bit differently than perhaps other people, however you do it, I'm using my fingers now to manipulate, and I have a lot more fine motor control to be able to do that. Versus if I do this is a lot harder to do because I'm now relying on larger muscles to be able to perform a very fine motor task. Where if I use these smaller muscles, which are much more sensitive to fine motor control, then that helps. But they don't really learn how to do that grasp until later. So they have to kind of go through these gross movements first because they don't have the control yet of the fingers to be able to do that. They only have what they have. Then here's a big table. Let me move myself out of here. A big table of all these things. Forearm on the table, upright body. This is all percentage of okay, kids between age 5 to 6.5, and this is kind of the critical window where they develop these abilities to really write more proficiently and to draw more proficiently. It occurs at this window here. Doing it on the wrong screen. 5.5 to 6.5 years old. And then these behaviors are things that you want to start to see to increase at this age, and most of them do, because this is something that is all going to be important for your ability to write and draw. And so I did some drawings for you here, and you can see here's a duck, there's the bill, there's the head, it's sleeping, there's the wings and its legs, it got hit by a car. And this is the first phase of drawing. About 15 to 20 months old, they're holding the pen like this, and they're just kind of going at it. It's very, not Picasso, I don't know what artist this looks like. It doesn't really look like art. But this is the first step, hand-eye coordination. My hand, this pen, my eye, that paper, bop, 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 bop. Beautiful. I did this, I made this for you. And then about 2 years of age, it's only about 6+ months later, then they can start to make what look like kind of funky representations. There's shapes now. There's some geometry here. Before it was just lines and scribbles. Now it looks like, oh, this is a circle. This looks like this is you, Daddy, and you have crazy hair, and then you have legs, and that's it. So their ability to take what's in their head and put it on paper isn't quite there. But then as they get to 5 to 6 years old, this is this critical period. All of a sudden, oh, look how this is very good geometry. So this looks more like a circle. This more looks like a body with head and lines. And so these are straight lines. These aren't squiggly lines. So if you look at the previous one, it's kind of like weird kind of curves to my legs. Just here, my legs are very nice and straight, and I have this nice potato body. And it begins the combination of a head with a body and legs, and these things are what makes it more advanced now compared to like this is your body, you have one giant head, and then you have these weird stilts for legs. And then when they get older, now 8 to 9 years, okay, to make this thing. But it looks good. You can tell what it is. This is a kid walking an elephant or a dog or some kind of giant sheep, alpaca type thing, along a fence. And you can tell what it is now compared to previously where it was, this is me and my dog. Oh, that's a nice dog. Or this is me and my dog. Oh, okay. So the representations become more and more exact, and the shapes become much more combined. The geometry becomes a little bit better. So now it's shapes within shapes and shapes on shapes, and now my legs and my arms aren't sticks. I have hockey stick legs, and I have these kind of nice arms with fingers on them. And so it's something that takes years in order to develop, unsurprisingly, right? This is not something that can just be done very easily because it takes a lot of prehension, it takes a lot of coordination, it takes sensation, it takes coordination, all the Asians, and to be able to get to this point, right? And so this is why this is so vitally important to be able to do this. Although you say it's not a great work of art, but to be able to do this takes a lot of components, and it's really the development of motor skill and motor development is the combination of all these components together. So drawing, although we take it for granted, it's incredibly important for a young child's motor development. And unfortunately, as we kind of transition to these last slides, so this talks about all about handwriting development. Age 4 can write letters. They're not organized though. They can't really write their name, but 5 to 6, then they can start to write their name, but it's very large. So it's still a gross motor control, kind of. And the letters, they're all ugly. They're irregularly shaped. Age 7 can master upper and lowercase letters. Single stroke letters, so now instead of having to write an A like this, and then like this, I can now just go, wow, easy, great, much more efficient. And then the spacing of letters too. So all of these things are very important for being able to perceive how things should fit in space, the size of them, and my efficiency to do so. Those are all things that are hugely important for motor development, but also just being able to write, and writing it provides you with that. And so because we have a very clear context of what is good writing and what is bad writing, or what is improved writing, not to say things are good or bad, this is something that is vitally important for a kid to be able to develop over all these years. So age 4 to age 9, basically from kindergarten to 3rd grade, these are things that they should be practicing a lot. Not because they need to be able to write, but because it's important for their motor development, but also probably to help write. Handwriting and drawing in adulthood. Older adults do not write as legible as younger adults, probably because of this lack of haptic sensation. Move over here. And then of course as you get older, especially here, drawing, notable decline in performance at age 75. And so again, things just begin to decline, unfortunately. But of course, if you use it, you won't lose it as quickly. That's kind of the adage here. Before we talked about if you don't use it, you lose it. That's true. In this case, if you use it, you don't lose it as quickly. And so that's really the reverse of that saying. Not to confuse or anything. Geesh. Okay. And then keyboarding. So obviously we're moving to a more computerized society. Everyone has a phone. Everybody knows how to text. Everyone writes emails. And so the elimination of cursive in writing, we need to kind of double check that, especially as we also get rid of PE programs. We're really trying to become much more kind of technology-based society, and that's okay. But we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we need to be able to develop motorically. And not just motorically, but also how development of the motor system also feeds into our ability to perform academically, socially, and cognitively, like all the domains that we talked about. And so to get rid of these things is probably something that we need to pump the brakes on a little bit. And it's much more important to be able to study the capability of handwriting versus keyboarding, even though it looks like that younger people are becoming much better at that than being able to write, keyboarding that is. And so it's something to consider. All of the positives that handwriting and drawing provides to a child, missing out on the experience, perhaps during a very critical window between that like 4 to 9 years of age, you wonder what we're missing out on if we don't have that practice then, because trying to do it later we might never be able to catch up. But it remains to be seen. Okay, everybody, that is the end of this lecture for today. Hopefully everything worked out okay. In the future, I'm going to be increasing the types of demonstrations without trying to get too long. I know that if I just give myself infinite amount of time to ramble and juggle in front of you, then that doesn't help anybody. But of course, hopefully this ability to see me now helps supplement and improve the learning of these types of remote lecturing that we're doing now. And keep tuned for future things in the future. Yeah, that makes sense. We're going to try and still do some interesting stuff. Perhaps live, but we'll find out. We'll see how it works. Okay. Stay safe, stay well, stay healthy, stay happy. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.